Good morning and welcome. So this is our fourth module in the Open Online course. So today we're going to be looking at the Demand and Capacity Modelling Principles, part 2 of 2. So last week we covered the first section with Paul, and then this week we'll be kind of carrying on those core principles that underpin everything that we do in demand and capacity. For those who are just joining, I'm sure you know the drill by now, but if you can keep most of your microphones on mute and then just join to the Slido, that's really helpful. Natasha will also be posting in a link to the registration, so if you can just fill that in and let us know you're here, that's really helpful as well. So just quick introductions. There's three of us on the call today. So that's me on the left. Unless you haven't attended any of them, you would have seen me before, but I'm part of the demand and capacity team and I'm leading on this course. I'm sort of overseeing it and will be on all of the webinars with you. So if you have any questions about the course as well as the content, feel free to pop them in the questions or contact me afterwards. We've also got Natasha, who's been supporting us through quite a few of these webinars. Natasha, do you want to say a quick hello?
Good morning. I'll be supporting the Slidos at the moment, so if you've got any questions, send them on there, or you can contact us on our email address.
So yeah, if you do have any questions, please do put them in the Slido question thing. And then we also have Edwin joining us today. Do you want to say a quick hello?
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name's Edwin. Some of you may recognise me from the summer series of webinars, which I organised back in June to August. It seems like a while ago now. You'll have to excuse me, I've injured my leg, I've ruptured my Achilles, hence why. But really lovely to be here this morning with you.
Never done it before, actually.
Thanks a lot, Edwin. So yeah, there'll be the three of us on the call today, and do just ask questions as we go along. So in terms of what we're covering today, we're going to be looking at statistical process control, or SPC charts. We're also going to be looking at percentiles, sustainable waiting list, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers as well. And then a little overview of what we're going to be looking at next. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to do it yet, we'll just about to go on to our first Slido question. So if you want to just connect to Slido, and you can do it two ways, either use the QR code on the screen, or if you just go onto any web browser at all and put in slido.com and then the code that we've got there, it'll take you to exactly the same place. So I think the first question will be quite familiar to a lot of you because we've been using this as we go through. So this is just our little check-in on how is everyone doing today. So if you have a little look at the sliding scale of emoji faces, have a little think, which emoji feels like you today? And then we'll just have a little look at how people are doing in the room. I feel like good and tired are always the top two contenders, which is fair enough. Oh, good is definitely overtaking this time. I would say for the most part, as I've gone through, I was probably on the good, happy, super sort of end of the spectrum. But I'm reluctant to admit it, but I'm probably on the tired today rather than anything else. Not to say that I'm not good, but tiredness is kind of trumping a little bit today, I'm afraid. Where do you think you are, Edwin, on the emoji scale?
That too. I mean, I can't complain too much. I think I started my physio, which probably has something to do with it. I do like the nuance between okay and fine, and okay seems to be edging ahead there. But there's different types of feeling average. I think so happy that it's gone back down. But yeah, I think it's great to see most people are doing good, but understandably there's a lot going on at the moment, so a lot of people are feeling tired, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, and the okay and tired are just kind of swapping between themselves, aren't they?
Happy's up.
Yeah, happy's edging its way up.
It's difficult to pick. You have to pick one. So people may be feeling multiple. You can be happy and tired at the same time.
Yeah, it's very true. Thank you for carrying on putting those in. So I'm just going to give us a very quick overview of where we are in the course. So we're on the 4th module now, and as I said, this one is around looking at those principles that really underpin demand and capacity, and we've split it over 2. So we had Paul joining us last week, and we've got Edwin joining us this week, just to look at those core bits that really don't change no matter where you're modelling or how you're doing it. We will then have next week where we look at how you kind of prepare for your demand and capacity modelling. So from a practical point of view, what data do you need? How might you get it? What you need to look out for. And then we have a little bit of a gap between the 4th and 5th module. And this is primarily because we recognise that if people are following along with their project as they go, you probably will need a bit of extra time to do the data collection. It's quite a time-consuming task, and we just kind of wanted to acknowledge that if that's how if you're actually following it as we go through, you will need a bit more time. We have the option in that week in the middle, so on the 28th of October, if people are interested, I'm very happy to play the full core model walkthrough. So I know not everyone's going to use the core model, but it probably is the one that people use most and where a lot of people start. And we have a very comprehensive video walkthrough of how to use it, how to prepare it, and all of the things you need to take into account. I'm very happy for us to use that Wednesday morning on the 28th as a totally optional session for those who want it, to just play that and then maybe have some of the technical team on standby for questions if people are interested. If you're not interested, then that's absolutely fine. You can watch it in your own time and ask questions on the Future NHS platform just as and when you watch it and as and when the questions come up. I'm very happy to be kind of guided by you really on what you'd find most useful. Around about that same time, we will start the mentoring sessions. So Natasha will be sending out links next week for people to sign up to those. So the mentoring sessions are for those people who have attended all the course or caught up on the different webinars if you weren't able to attend live. And the other thing that we ask is that you quite clearly articulate what you want to be mentored on, because it'll mean we can prepare a little bit more and also make sure that the best people are on the call if there's any particular specialist expertise needed. So just start thinking about that. If that's something you think you want to be doing, start thinking about how you might frame that question. And as I said, if you do have any questions about the course generally, feel free to put them in the Slido questions and answer box as well. So we're now going to move on to the kind of core bit of the principles. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is SPC. So I'm going to hand over to Edwin now.
I just realised I'm on mute, so that would help if I turn that off. Can you see?
Yeah, can see the slides.
Great. So I'm going to talk a bit about statistical process control, or SPC charts. And bearing in mind this is a principles module, we're going to cover the basic principles of SPC and how it applies to demand and capacity. I recognise for many of you, you will have come across this before. So it's a good refresher, and it's good to kind of see how why this is useful in a demand and capacity context. Some of you may not have come across this before, so you may have seen SPC. So this is when people talk about SPC, this is what we're referring to. So at a fundamental level, SPC is a tool which helps us differentiate normal variation from special cause variation in any sort of process, looking at data over time. So for those of you kind of more, analytically interested, it's sort of like thinking about a normal distribution curve sideways, looking at the data over time. So we think about what is normal. I mean, normal is quite subjective in everyday parlance. But in SPC, it has quite a clearly defined definition, which is around when you look at your data over time when a given process, is the data within the bounds of set limits, and we'll come on to what that looks like in a minute. But if I just to give you an example, just to illustrate this, and you may have heard this before, it's a common example around commuting. So you can think about commuting as a process in the fact that you're going from A to B. There's steps along the way. If you're taking a car, you have to get into the car, you have to drive along, you may encounter traffic, you may, put on your sat nav and all these different steps in the process. At the moment, it feels like we're living in a different world. Some of us are working from home, some people are commuting to their trust still. So if we imagine you're commuting to your local trust in your car, say, because this is about randomness. So this is really good tool for random processes or where there's random elements. So in driving, there's so many different variables and factors that affect how long that would take. So say it normally takes you between 45 minutes and an hour to drive from your home door to door to your trust in the morning. You can see that every day that when you go, you wouldn't expect it to be, say, 45 minutes exactly, unless you're extremely lucky that you would just that, and that actually wouldn't be normal. You would normally, intuitively expect there to be some level of variation. So one day it might be 45 minutes, one day it might be 47, one day it might be an hour, an hour and 2 minutes. So you could plot that over time. On the x-axis has the different days, and then just jot on a paper on your y-axis how long in minutes that will take. And actually, we do encounter this a lot in healthcare, and many of you in the day-to-day basis use run charts. So an SPC is just a run chart, and that's just plotting your data over time. And when you connect the data, it sort of does a zigzag, and that's sort of what you'd look at as normal data. So just thinking about that example, and in your day-to-day life, and feel free to use a healthcare example, within your clinic or setting that you're working in. How do we adjust for normal variation in our day-to-day lives? In the example that I mentioned, the way that I would adjust to that if I was driving to work would be to perhaps leave 15 minutes early. Say I needed to get there for 8 a.m. and I know it takes between 45 minutes and an hour. I'd leave at least by 7 a.m. if not 6:45, just to make sure. And I think we just intuitively do this. But think about those types of variation and processes you experience on a day-to-day basis. If we go to the Slido now, so some of you will have this up, but if you're not on there already, just go to slido.com, type in the code DC-4, and you should see the poll. If you click on polls, you can type in multiple answers, but just give an example of how you adjust for variation in your day-to-day life. It could be that example about how you adjust in your commuting or other processes. And we'll just we'll give you a minute there to answer that.
Coming up big and bold as a starting. Set clock fast.
Plan ahead. And that's something, within our control that we can. Okay, so we've got a few more things coming in now. To-do lists, contingency. I like the randomness. I like that answer. Embrace the randomness, embrace the chaos.
I think it's an interesting one as well, because people have quite it can be quite personality driven how people respond to variation in their day-to-day lives. So I think everyone will know team members or maybe even family members who are always a tiny bit late. So their way of kind of working with the variation is that they always slightly err on the side of not waiting around when they get somewhere, but keeping other people waiting. And there's others who will always be early. I'm an always early person. I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing, but it's just the way I am.
Yeah, I think a lot of things about allowing extra time, and yeah, it feels like, as human beings, we kind of intuitively adjust to how long things normally take, and we know when something's unusually long. So in that example, if there was a traffic accident, there may be a backlog of traffic. So we know, we'd have to call ahead and say, I'm sorry, something's happened on the road. But it's not something you would normally plan for because it's quite rare. So I think this is what this is all about, really.
There's a few people saying things, different wordings, but similar things. So there's building contingency, including buffers, allow extra time, plan for delays. There's plan to be early. There's this whole kind of sphere of looking at what that variation is and then planning because of it.
Yeah, and I can see something about learning and adapting, which is really good, because the more, if you just started the job, you actually might even do a test drive before you start the job on day one to see how long it will take. A lot of people do that. But over time, you just really become attuned to which days there are traffic, what's the best time to drive, should you actually leave much earlier so you have a quick drive and all that sort of thing. And I think that's all part of the QI process, and we've touched upon that before, that this demand and capacity QI project you're doing is an iterative process. So actually, the more times you look at your data and your process, the more you'll be able to refine that and how you plan for that. So we've got quite a few responses there.
There's also sorry, Edwin. There's embrace the carnage, which just makes me smile. So I just thought I'd share that.
I think sometimes you just have to do that, and they can give you a lot of energy. Life is random, so it's just one of those facts. And I think that's where that alone we can use statistics to do that, because actually the randomness gives predictability in that sense. And we can actually predict, so if you have enough data, what's going to happen on average. So perhaps we can come back to that. Should I maybe continue, and we can always, please do keep giving your answers, and we can share these after as well, because it's quite interesting. I'm going to just go back to here. So if we look at the SPC charts itself, this may be very familiar to some of you, so apologies if this is covering things, but it's always good to revisit. And I'm not going to go into too much into the technical details. We have different types of SPC charts, but effectively, in the example I talked about, so if we look at this trust example, on the left-hand side on the y-axis, imagine these are minutes a patient is waiting, and imagine those are different patients on the bottom, or a patient on different days, and you can see that it will vary. There'll be elements of randomness about that, but you'd generally expect the data to be roughly around the mean. So that middle line there, where the data points are kind of oscillating around, that is the average of those data points. And what you can see here is that, by and large, that data is falling within the bounds, and it's actually kind of relatively close to the average. So we'd look at that and say that where the arrow is pointing, that data is normal because it's really close to the mean. So you could say that that patient was waiting sort of what we'd expect on average. But actually, what happened to those other data points there is that, say we're looking at one patient, something has happened. There's some sort of downward trend. So the waiting time had drastically reduced, and that is actually because there's enough data points in that trend. We're not just looking at two data points, which is often what people tend to do. That there is enough to say that something has happened there that is not normal, and actually we have something going outside of the bounds. We'll talk about in a second, but that is also not normal, because the bounds of those data, and I'll come on to that now, so we call them the control limits. You have the upper control limit and the lower control limit. Now, how that is determined is through, now many of you are statistical wizards, probably with PhDs, and I'm not going to teach you like eggs, but this you can use different rules, but this is essentially you could use standard deviations, or what we call sigma, which is derived from that. But essentially, you can have, if you're being quite strict with your data. 99% of the data might fit in there, or the majority of the data. So that data point that's right at the bottom there, it's actually that could be, say, less than 1% chance that that data falls outside of that. And you can see that's like about an hour. Say this is an A&E wait or something, and so that patient got seen really quickly that day. So something not normal has happened, or going back to the previous terms, special cause variation has happened. And essentially, the SPC chart, it's the same as a run chart, but you're putting on guides, and it's flagging to you when something unusual's happened that you should investigate. Now, it could be just viewed from mere chance that if you just have enough data that there might just be some day where patients decided not to come in that day and they just got an express, visit. But it could have been also, staff that day were doing a different process and managed to speed things up. So it's actually worth investigating.
And you'll probably find, if you're looking at data over the last sort of 6 months with COVID, you'll see a lot of not normal data. So there'll be a lot of data where you might have quite a stable system for a while, and then you'll start to see these kind of flagged up areas that are either unusually low or unusually high.
Yeah, exactly. And the great thing about SPC as a tool, and it's actually part of the core model, is that in the tool, when you enter your data, usually the tool will flag these up for you. I mean, you could also identify them yourself, but most templates, and we will signpost to them on the future NHS, and many of you may be familiar with Making Data Count, and Samantha Riley's team, so with them. There's lots more resources around different templates you can use, so you don't have to worry about sort of flagging up these yourself. But that's why I said you don't need to have, sort of a PhD in statistics to use this statistical tool. So many of you have been familiar with SPC, and many of you actually will have used it in this context already. But the reason why we're talking about SPC is to answer the question: is our data set good enough to predict from? If we're trying to predict what future demand will be, we want to usually look at historical demand, because by and large, the past is usually the best predictor of the future. Now, of course, we've had exceptions, and if you were to do this last year, looking back at this year, this has been a bit like a black swan moment where not many people saw this coming. Some people did, but the data will be quite unusual. But by and large, there are, I mentioned I've ruptured my Achilles, and in the fracture clinic, actually the level of accidents, which is what happened to me, might actually be the same despite COVID. So they actually, using your historical data set is what you want to basis for your demand and capacity modeling. But you want to check, is this data set good enough, or is it going to be really abnormal data where you actually can't really infer? So if you plotted your historical data, say over the last year from 2019, for your service, if you're looking at a service clinic, and your SPC chart highlighted that it was mostly normal, or what we call stable, that's a good sign. But you may get some things which flag up, and this is where you need to investigate what's happened. And this is why we talk about the demand capacity being collaborative, because you may have to go and speak to your colleagues or the clinicians or administrative staff and find out what happened. It may be a process or data quality issue, that's possible. You may have a genuine trend. Avoid the rule of thumb is avoid trends from 2 data points or 2 or 3, which red, amber, green. When something goes below the average is the classic, and it turns red, suddenly people panic. And I think that's what we're trying to move away from, because that doesn't really tell you much, because then you go back into the green. What we're probably experiencing now on that list is paradigm shift of many ways. People may be reluctant to come in now more to hospital for certain services, so you might some services. You may want to be doing video conferencing, for example. So actually, all of your data may shift downwards, and that might be your new normal, or it may have increased dramatically due to increased activity, for example, the ambulance services or whatever. Or that might, if you see an anomaly that's completely out of your control limits, it may just be a completely random event, which does happen too. But the important thing is you go in and understand, investigate, go speak to people that are involved. And once you can rule out the abnormalities or things which are special cause variation, and actually your general data set is stable, then you can say, actually, I can use this to forecast, what the demand will be this year. So that's why we're looking at that. So just on that, just think about the data you're going to be using, and we're going to come on more to that in the next few sessions. And don't worry so much about COVID. A lot of people might think, actually, I can't, because I can't look at historical data because now it's completely different. It may be completely different, but actually your baseline, which you build upon, it's good to use your historical data as a baseline and then adjust from there.
And we will, just as a little reminder, we have that last session at the end of this course, which is very specifically looking at how to factor in COVID, and it will vary a little bit from service to service. So there's kind of two options. You can bring it up in your mentoring sessions, but we will also, as I say, cover how to sort of factor those things in and look at how you can use historical data to still usefully inform what might happen going forward.
Thank you, Alice. That's a really good point. So there's lots of different types of SPCs and lots of rules. So say, for example, think about there's lots of a few points below the mean or the average. Some people say, oh, if it's 5 points or if it's 7 or if it's 9, that's the correct one. But actually, they might all be correct. It just gives you different levels of assurance that something unusual has happened. So if you think about it, above and below the mean, if you were to say flip a coin a few times, one time you'd expect 50-50 to 25%. If you flip it 5 times, and I'm not sure of the exact math, I think it's like 3% or something like that chance that you get heads 5 times in a row. But then if you flipped it 7 times, it will be less than 1%, like just about 1%. Those two, if you already say 5 or 7, they're both really unlikely, and actually you can have confidence that something unusual has happened. So don't get too hung up on the rules, whether they say 5 points. I would say use as many data points as you can. A year's worth of data is really good. Generally, I mean, again, it really depends, but between at least minimum 15 and 25 data points. But just as much as you can, and if you're looking at service, we'll say a year's worth of data is probably a good place to start. And as you can see there, things look for things that stand out: extreme values, trends, and oscillations. It's probably something slightly less relevant, but that's when you kind of see it bouncing up and down fairly regularly. But it's more about the extreme values and trends that you should sort of look out for. So just in summary, when you're thinking SPC and demand capacity, it's around determining the stability of your data set and whether you can use this to predict the future. Use the SPC tool to highlight anomalies and investigate them. And you can use SPC for other things, which, I mentioned making data count, which we will signpost to on future NHS. SPC tool is a great tool for decision making, particularly with leaders, not looking at red, amber, green, moving away from that, looking at data over time and actually making decisions when something unusual has happened, and also when something good has happened, identifying when you've made a good intervention with your quality improvement project and it's shifted, you've created a paradigm shift in your process and improve things for patients, which is ultimately what the goal is. So you can use SPC side along that, because what you'll find when you're doing a demand and capacity project is that you'll find those opportunities to do improvement. So I will stop there, and perhaps I will stop sharing my screen.
So just before we go onto that, there's one question. So we're going to go on to percentiles, but there's just one question that we've got on the Slido. What type of SPC chart should I use for capacity and demand? So the models that we use, so the models that our team have created, have SPC charts built into them. So you're able to use those to look at your demand data and plot what is the normal and what's the not normal inside that data set. I think you can definitely load in multiple years worth of data, and then you tend to use 1 year's worth to sort of define your parameters. So that's what those upper and lower control limits will be defined on, that 1 year slice, but you can decide which slice it is. So if you have a look at the core model, or any of the models, to be honest, that we produce, you'll be able to have an SPC chart sort of built in. If you're wanting to look at using a different tool, or if you're wanting to just look at like analysing SPC anyway, more generally, as Edwin mentioned a couple of times, Making Data Count, which is led by Sam Riley. If you go onto Future NHS, there's links to her work, which is on the NHS Improvement website. So you can have a proper look at what's there and what's available. There's a whole range of resources. She's done some really, really comprehensive work. But there you'll be able to kind of get a sense of how SPC can be used more broadly. But specifically for demand and capacity, it's probably easiest to use the one built into the model. And if you do use it and have any questions, just either pop the questions in the chat here, or if you put it onto Future NHS, we can answer questions throughout the week as well. So there's a couple more questions. And thank you for people who are liking the questions. It really is very helpful to be able to sort them into order in terms of which people are most interested in. So we've got, is there good guidance on re-baselining and de-seasonalizing? So there is guidance in Sam Riley's work around that, specifically around looking at COVID. We're going to look at that in the last module because that's a kind of different thing again. But for generally the seasons, etc., that is in the in Sam Riley stuff, and in our models that we've produced, you can put in seasons if that is relevant to your service. A lot of services presume they have more seasonality than the data actually shows, so I would use it with a little bit of caution, but we can definitely unpick that for you when you get to it if that's something you're interested in looking at. So there are more questions coming in. We will get to them as we go through. I'm going to start on the percentiles, and we will make sure that we revisit the questions a bit more as we go through. So percentiles is just another way of sort of practically using and looking at variation. So we see this natural variation all the time. As Edwin said, you're commuting to work. Sometimes it might be 45 minutes, sometimes it might be an hour. And humans are really good at naturally understanding variation and sort of accommodating it as we go through. Percentiles is a way of looking at that. So it's a way of looking at how many data points fit within a certain range and where you might want to draw your line. So when we were talking about those sort of real world examples where people adjust their behavior slightly, and that kind of very natural thing that people have different tolerances of where they would draw the line and how they would adjust for it. Percentile starts to sort of unpack that. So we're just going to watch a quick animation. Now I'm hoping that the sound comes through. If it doesn't, can someone please tell me, because it sometimes is a bit pernickety, and I will make it, reshare it and make the sound happen. So let me know if you can't hear anything when this starts.
Can't hear that.
Okay. Thank you, Edwin. Let me just, I'm not entirely sure why stopping sharing and resharing does the trick, but it does. It does seem to.
Like turning it on, off and on again.
There is
Yeah.
a little tick box saying include system audio.
Thank you. I've literally just seen that. So I always wait for it to pop up and then click on it, but that is much more convenient. Okay. Let me rewind to the start.
When planning any kind of service, you have to be sure that the capacity you put in place can deal with the demand that's coming through the door, especially in a sector like ours, where referrals can vary from week to week. Using a waiting list helps smooth this out, but managing a sustainable waiting list is all about matching demand and capacity. Too much capacity could mean wasting valuable resources. Too much demand and not enough capacity, and your waiting list will get longer until it's impossible for you to see all your patients within a maximum waiting time. So where do you draw the line? Just how much capacity do you need to cope with the variability in demand and not allow the waiting list to grow? Agner Erlang was a statistician who developed a method of calculating how to do this in the 1920s. His work suggested that capacity needs to be set to somewhere between the 80th and 85th percentile of the variation of demand. But what is a percentile? A percentile is simply a way of dividing a data set into 100 equal parts. Some percentiles have special names. For example, we call the 50th percentile the median, and the 75th percentile the upper quartile. Let's say if you have a set of 10 measurements and put them in order from lowest to highest, because we have an even number of data points, the 50th percentile will be the midpoint of two middle values, which in our data set are 28 and 36. So this will be 32, because 50% of your measurements are either equal to or below that number. Which is why even though these numbers range from 1 to 100, the 50th percentile isn't 50. Here there are only 3 measurements equal to or over 50, so it's quite exceptional for them to go over 50. In 50% of our measurements, we get a value of 32 or less. Understand? Good. Now that you understand percentiles, let's look at an example based in the real world. Let's say you recorded the number of new referrals you've received in orthopedics every week for the last 20 weeks. There will naturally be some variation from week to week. To find our percentile, like before, we reorder the list by the number of referrals from the smallest to the largest. We now want to figure out which percentile will give us a good balance between over-providing capacity and keeping our waiting list manageable. Erlang's work suggests that this should be between the 80th and 85th percentile. From experience, we have found that the percentile at which you should have your capacity for a healthcare service can be between the 65th to 85th percentiles. In this example, for simplicity, we will use the 80th percentile. 80% of 20 is 16, so we take the week with the 16th highest number of referrals in it, which gives us a value of 75. Assuming that future demand behaves in a similar way, if we aim to see 75 people on our waiting list each week, in only 4 weeks out of 20 would demand outstrip supply, and our waiting list get longer. In the other 16 weeks, we should have enough capacity to meet demand, so the waiting list should get shorter or stay the same length. When trying to decide which percentile to set for the capacity of your own service, you'll need to look at 2 main factors: how urgently your patients need to be seen, and how variable your demand is. As a general rule of thumb, bigger services will experience less variation than smaller ones. So, if you have a small cancer service and your patients need to be seen urgently, within 2 weeks for example, then setting your capacity to the 85th percentile of demand will keep your waiting list shorter and help to ensure that they are all seen in time. On the other hand, a large, non-urgent dermatology outpatient clinic with a relatively stable level of demand will probably have a bit more leeway. So setting the capacity to the 65th percentile of demand might be a better way of resourcing your clinics in this instance. It is only by gathering and reviewing your own figures and assessing the needs of your service and patients that you'll then be able to make an informed judgment about which percentile value to use. This will then enable you to make the best of the resources you have, as well as being able to manage a sustainable and effective waiting list.
Now, some of you may have spotted an error in that animation. So there's another little extra bit, which I think is still on this version. Which embarrassingly, when we created the video, we didn't spot. Oh, no, it's not in this version. So did anybody spot the mistake? I'll give you a heads up. So when we had the non-urgent dermatology outpatient graph, I wonder if I can go back and show it.
We have a Colin in the chat that he typed it in Slido. Let's have a
Okay.
look.
So here we go. When we put the line here, this is obviously not the 65th percentile. So for those of you who were eagle-eyed, you would have seen this and gone, well, that's not right, and you're absolutely correct. It should be somewhere probably about here-ish. So apologies for that. I every time I watch it, it slightly grates on me. So I'm just going to have a little look at the questions in Slido. Do we have any new questions specifically on percentiles? So we've got here. Oh, so I think this is more about the SPC, but we can answer this as well. If after investigation it's found the anomaly in the data is due to a one-off incident, do we remove that data or keep it? So that's a really interesting question. And I think it's one that comes up quite a lot. So by using things like SPC and percentiles, you're basing your decisions on what the normal is. So what that kind of bulk in the middle of where most of your data points fall, that's what you're going to be using to make your decisions. And because of that, actually having the odd point, which is wildly outside it, doesn't really change the data that you're going to be using very drastically. If you have a lot of data points outside, then it can do more. So that might show that you have a much higher range of variation than you're expecting. But the odd data point, as long as you're understanding what it is and why it's there, it probably isn't too much of a problem to have it still included. In the model, there is the option of excluding a particular data point. So if there's something that's just wildly wrong, you can take it out, and that's an option. But we always say use it with quite a lot of caution, because if that data point is still part of the overall number of referrals you expect to see in a year, that total can be quite useful to have accurate still. Whereas if that wildly different data point is actually just a completely phony number that managed to get in there somehow, excluding it might make a bit more sense. So I hope that answers the question. But if it doesn't, obviously do come back to us. Can we replicate SPC methodology in Excel, or would we need the tool? You can absolutely do it in Excel. So there's plenty of instructions in SAM's making data count in terms of how to make an SPC chart. There's also loads of stuff on Google. So if you have a little look, it's not too difficult to do. And certainly if you're wanting to do a standalone SPC, that's absolutely fine. So there's someone here saying they use the NHS Improvement SPC tool and it's excellent. It's great, isn't it? I mean, it's not my work at all, but when you're just quite proud of what a colleague has done, it's a fantastic tool. Can special causes be excluded from your data calculations in SPC? Yeah, you absolutely can. How important is it to compare with others? That will depend a lot on how similar you feel your service is to other services. So it might be really valuable, or it might be totally irrelevant. And I know it's a kind of non-answer, that one, but it really does depend on what service you're looking at and how useful you find that. And then here we go. Here's one's on percentiles. Re-percentiles, the high numbers appeared multiple times, so wouldn't you need to take that into account? E.g., if you have 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 5, the median is 2, not 3. So in terms of percent, I mean, you're right around the median calculations, and in the SPC that will definitely carry through. For the percentiles, you're pretty much just batching where you're expecting your data to fall. So if you have loads of data points, it will shift where that 75th, 85th, 90th percentile is in terms of where it falls, but it almost doesn't matter underneath that how many times it's 2 or 3. So if we go back to our commuting analogy, if you know that it normally takes between 45 minutes and 60 minutes to get into work, on the days when you're just normally commuting, you might leave an hour if you're someone who always wants to be on time or early, or you might leave 50 minutes if you're someone who doesn't mind being late occasionally. And again, that's a personal tolerance in terms of that degree to which you're willing to wait for others or you're willing for others to wait for you. And that is a personality driven one. But there are similar analogies in terms of healthcare because, and we're going to go on to this with the ideal waiting list size. So I shall take us onto this. It brings us onto this concept of how long people can safely wait versus how long they can't. So that's where that urgency bit of it comes in. If you have a service that's really, really urgent, so it's absolutely vital that people are seen quickly, you're going to have more capacity because on the days when there aren't as many people, you're just going to have to accept that there'll be a bit of spare capacity, because on the days when you have lots of people that need to be seen urgently, you're going to need that many people to be there in terms of all that level of capacity to be available. So it really does depend on the tolerance of risk and the degree to which you're varying. So with the commute example, for your normal commute, most people are probably okay being 5 minutes late or early, maybe even 10 minutes late or early, depending on what your team is and how it all kind of works and the focus of your role. If you had a job interview, you'd probably want to err on the side of caution and you'd be leaving earlier just to kind of account for that degree of variation. Percentiles is looking at that. So it's looking at, okay, so if I know it might take between 45 and 60, how many minutes am I going to leave before I need to be there? So it's all about just deciding where that tolerance to risk is going to be. So I think that's far too much of me talking. We will revisit the questions and I will make sure that we get through to them. If there are any that you're particularly interested in, do like them and we'll make sure we answer those first. But as we've started to naturally start talking about waiting lists, hopefully you've all watched the animation. So I know Natasha sent it around on Monday. We have an animation which is a very similar style to the one you've just seen, which looks at the ideal waiting list size and how that works. So do have a watch because it's a really great resource. We often talk about waiting lists in quite negative terms, like inside the NHS, people waiting too long is something obviously we want to avoid, and it can have a massive impact on patients. So if we think to the patient video that we saw right at the start of the course, we don't want to be in the position where people are having to wait unnecessarily. And certainly for those people who get seen promptly, it can be absolutely life-changing. So what we're going to look at now is how the waiting list works and what the ideal size of a waiting list is. And when I say ideal size, I don't mean how many people can you fit in your waiting room. And I do realise that's changed a lot with COVID. So suddenly there's a lot less capacity in waiting rooms than there used to be. What we're talking about is what's that sustainable balance. So that on those days when there isn't enough capacity to see everyone, the waiting list will get a bit longer. And then there'll be days where there's more capacity than there are people, and the waiting list should get a bit shorter. Having a waiting list allows us to sort of buffer the amount of capacity that we provide so that we're using it as effectively as possible. So we don't want to have too long a waiting list because people will be waiting too long, and clinically that's quite dangerous and also really not a good patient experience. We don't really want to have it too short because if we are providing our capacity at the maximum level we ever need all the time, we're going to have a huge amount of unused capacity, and the NHS certainly doesn't have the budget to sustain that. So what we're looking at is what's that Goldilocks point? What's that bit in the middle where it's long enough that we get a bit of a buffer, but not so long that patients are waiting longer than they should. So we have the animation, which I'm hoping a few of you, or hopefully most of you have watched. And then we have this scenario. So I've been leaving it up on the screen in the hope that you might be having a little look through it. And what we're going to do is we're going to go on to Slido and ask you to answer this question. So have a little read through, think about how it works. And as I said, for those of you who've watched the video recently, this will be a lot easier. For those of you who haven't, it might be quite tricky. So it might be a bit of a mixed bag. It'll be interesting to see. We're going to leave this up for longer than normal. So normally, as soon as I ask a Slido question, we start to see everyone's answers. But I think it's probably important that people can see the actual details of the question. So apologies, I'm going to look on my phone so that I can see the live results. And once we've got a fair number of them, we'll swap over, but we'll leave this up a little bit longer, just so people get a chance to look at the example and unpack it. While you're doing that, I'll just see if there's any other questions I can quickly answer. Oh, so someone here, James, thank you for this, has said that there's an SQL version of SPC available as well. So yeah, that's a really good point. There are various different ways you can build an SPC chart.
And do feel free, James, to share that on the future NHS, for the benefit of everyone else. I think there's lots of models people develop, so it's always good to share if people are familiar with SQL.
So someone's put a question in here. How does the percentile method work alongside strict access to KPIs, i.e. if there's 4 weeks in 20 demand surges, then that could cause a KPI breach and therefore penalties. So that is where you need to be looking at your kind of risk analysis really, in terms of what level of variation you're seeing. One of our previous colleagues used to say that you can use it to plan how many times a year you're going to panic. And it's a slightly melodramatic way of putting it, but it is also kind of true. So it's about looking at how many, when we had that animation with the referrals in little filing cabinet things, the weeks where you've got the red crosses and you don't have enough capacity, it has to be a service by service decision of how big a risk that is and what the penalties are, and therefore how many are going to be above that line. Oh, brilliant. Some people have put in some links as well. So that's really great. So yeah, there's also R, which is a fantastic resource. We'll lift those off and put them on Future NHS afterwards as well, or if anyone wants to post. So Natasha, do you want to show us the Slido results? People have had a little bit of time now. Let's see. Has everyone been reticent to put a number forward? Okay, so 132 is definitely the most popular, with 99 as a second, 96, 120. So weekly referral rates. So a bit of a range in terms of where people are putting that calculation. Brilliant. Okay, so I will be telling you the answer in just a moment. You won't be left in suspense. So in terms of waiting list, as I said, it acts as this buffer which can help you keep kind of just to manage the capacity that you're providing in terms of that variation. And it can also help with scheduling. So again, if you're seeing massive seasonality, you can potentially take that into account. Although a lot of services struggle to flex their capacity a lot for seasonality. So that's something, again, we can look at in a bit more detail later if people are interested in. But it really is that kind of buffer and just trying to maximize using your capacity without patients having to wait longer than they should. So as a general rule of thumb, the longer your waiting list is, the longer patients wait. But the flip side of that is the longer your patients can wait, the bigger your sustainable waiting list can be. So the metrics that you're needing to look at is when you're going to be seeing your patients and what that kind of window is that you need to see them in. And yeah, the longer they can wait, the bigger your sustainable wait can be. So if we go back to our dermatology example, if you're seeing people and actually they are able to wait a bit longer and it's fairly stable, then you can probably set your percentile at the 65th percentile, because those weeks where your capacity isn't as high as your demand, it's actually okay for them to wait a little bit until it catches up, and the variation wasn't as much, so therefore it's not going to happen that often. Whereas if you have something really urgent and pressing, obviously you need to see people when they first come through. This is the calculation, just so people are aware, and 132 is right. So those of you who put that in, which was the vast majority of you, or certainly the most popular answer by quite a long way, 132 is the answer that we're looking for. And the reason we put the plus and minus 5% there is because in the model we calculate this for you and we put a plus and minus 5% margin on it. So again, just accounting for real world variability, we would say that your ideal waiting list size should be in between, 5% either way, because pretty much no one's going to have a totally stable waiting list that's the same size every day, and it doesn't need to be. So it's about just kind of that realism in terms of the variation. So I hope that was useful and informative for people. I'm going to have a little look at the questions. Are there any questions? I'll leave this up though, because people might want to have a little look at it and think it through, and just check if there are any questions that have come through on waiting list sizes. Not so far, but feel free to either pop them into Slido, or as I say, if you put them on Future NHS, we're very happy to look at questions throughout the week. You don't have to save them up for today. Okay, so we've got one question coming through. Why do we divide by 2? Good question, and Edwin did warn me that people might want an explanation of how this is calculated so that we can unpack it. So if we look at this, we're looking at our demand, which is 33 in this example, and then we're adding together the start time and the kind of the window with which we're going to see them. So if you imagine that you've got, I'm going to try and explain this, and I hope this doesn't confuse things further. If you imagine that people are waiting for, say, 3 weeks before they're seen, you've then got, oh no, yeah, this is what we've got, so 3 to 5 weeks. So we're looking at that number, which is the window when people are seen. And then we're dividing it by 2 to get the mean. So in the same way that when you are looking at the average, you add everything up and divide it by 2. What we're looking at here is kind of the same sort of thing. So we're looking at when it starts, the window that we're going to see them in, which will kind of give us the same number, give us twice what we need, and then we're dividing it in half. I'm not sure if that is clarifying it or just muddying the waters. If it's if it is muddying the waters, do tell me, and I will try and put something more articulate on Future NHS, because I think it's, unfortunately, it's one of these ones that if it makes sense to you, it's quite easy to understand. If it doesn't, yeah. Edwin.
I think it's sort of small numbers, and I think imagine that 5 was like 10 or longer. It's just the 2 is just getting the average of that. And yeah, we can post like a derivation of that if that's helpful on Future NHS.
Okay, so we've got a few more questions coming in. I'll just give a moment for them to come in and for people to vote on which are most useful. In the meantime, for those of you, if you haven't done already, can you please fill in the registration link? And we'll also be posting the evaluation link, so please do fill that in. And just as a point, one of the pieces of feedback we got last week was that you didn't want the questions throughout the whole webinar quite so often. I think people felt it didn't help with the flow. So I've tried to keep it at just the end of each section with the majority of the time now. So I hope that's worked better for people. If you have any views like that and you want it changed back, do let me know. And we are really keen to act on the stuff that you say and change things as we go through. So here we've got a question. We often have a problem as we record demand as referrals or booked appointments, which is not a true waiting list. What would you advise? So I think what you're saying, and do correct me, I think what you're saying is that you don't necessarily have that tally of who's waiting before they get booked. For this purpose, for demand and capacity, our waiting list actually includes people who are booked and people who aren't booked. So if you have that metric, you can use that because it's about all the people who are currently waiting, whether they are waiting with an appointment or without an appointment. So for this purpose, having the aggregate would actually be what you need. If that isn't what you're asking, again, please do let me know. Does this ideal waiting list calculation vary depending on the type of service, i.e. acute versus mental health care? So the equation doesn't in terms of the way you calculate it. I'll just bring this back up, but the numbers you put in may well do. So this start and end time, the 5 and the 3, that window will probably change depending on the urgency profile, and that's what will change the overall result. And actually changing those start and end times can make a really big difference. So you can play with it a little bit to see how big a difference it makes, but that's what's going to influence the different types of service. Okay, I'm aware that we've got to 11 o'clock and there'll be some of you that need to rush off to meetings that are booked in straight afterwards. So thank you very, very much for those of you who've joined us. I'm very happy to stay on the phone for a bit longer and answer a few more questions, but for anyone who's needing to get on to the rest of their day, thank you. And obviously the recording will be up, so if people want to listen to the questions later, they can.
Thank you very much, everyone.